So those are the levels of the consciousness, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. But there's also a structural model that kind of fits in with the topographical model that Freud, describes. And these represent the three components of our personality that have different functions. One is the id, which is Latin for it. One is the ego, Latin for I, essentially I, like me. And superego, Latin for over I, so over myself. So in that the superego, what is maybe rules over it in some way. We'll talk about each of these components now. So here again is that iceberg component here. And again, here on the right side, you see the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind. Notice here you have, for example, the ego. The ego exists in the conscious mind, but also in the preconscious and a little bit in our unconscious as well. The superego, again, exists in both the conscious, unconscious, and preconscious. However, the id is entirely located in the unconscious here. And we'll talk about that as well, the kind of why that's important. So let's start with that id. It's the original part of our personality. It's present in our birth. In fact, if you were to, from Freud's point of view, a newborn baby is entirely id. The newborn baby has not yet developed an ego, not developed a sense of self, is entirely dependent on its mother for caregiving. It can't do anything for itself. It hasn't developed any moral sense. So it is just entirely 100% focused on getting its needs satisfied. And if any of you are moms, you know that when you have a newborn baby, you know that your newborn baby needs attention, it needs food, it needs comfort, and it needs it right away. It doesn't want to wait for it. And that's essentially how a newborn baby is. Well, it's again, from this perspective, it's kind of exactly what an id is like, what the id is like as well in our personality as adults, at least according to Freud. It is the part of our personality that is essentially, again, wants its needs satisfied right away, and it can't do it all by itself, but it pushes and pushes and pushes us. So again, this is a primitive part of our personality. It's biological, so in other words, our biological needs are met. The id's job is essentially to get our biological needs met, or at least to push us to get those needs met. It's entirely in our unconscious, so the thoughts and feelings essentially that are coming from there are going to be repressed thoughts. He calls it the engine of our personality. This is where all our psychic energy comes from. It pushes us to act. It pushes us to behave. It pushes us essentially to function in general. And it conforms to what he called the pleasure principle. The idea of the pleasure principle is that the true purpose of life is the immediate satisfaction of all needs. Okay? Notice here we're not talking about how to get those needs satisfied. We're talking that it doesn't care how. It just there's no worry about any risks, no cost-benefit analysis. It just wants it now. And that's obviously something that there's within us. So we can think about there may be something within us that wants immediate gratification, but in the real world, I guess we can't always get that. And if, again, we have these unmet needs, it's really an unpleasant experience, an aversive tension, and we have to try to find a way to relieve this tension. That's called the primary process. So that primary process is the primary way the id satisfies its needs. And the way Freud talked about it, remember where the id is located. It's in your unconscious. So the idea is to form a mental image of the object, or that activity that would meet its needs. And essentially that is what he would call wish fulfillment. So for example, if you have a need, which is hunger, real need that we have, the id's job essentially is to give us an image of a juicy cheeseburger, satisfy the needs of the id, at least temporarily, but again, it's not, the id itself cannot go out and get a hamburger, you see. The id exists entirely in the unconscious, so it cannot it doesn't know the difference between images and reality. It doesn't care how needs are met, and it of course can be irrational, reckless, and immoral. It can get us into trouble if we rely on our id to essentially fully guide our behavior. So the id, existing in the unconscious, it pushes us to get our needs satisfied, sexual needs and whatnot, life needs, if you think about it. Pushes us to get our needs satisfied, and it's not, but it exists in our unconscious, so it can't really act on it itself. Next component of our personality would be the ego, and it comes from the id, again, because the id can't get its needs satisfied by itself. It can't deal with reality. So it's primarily at the conscious level, the ego. This is the part of us, remember the I, when you think the Latin I or me, and this is the part of our personality that is directly interacting with the real world for the most part. And this is, the operation here is the reality principle. Realize this, the ego is not a moral component. That's the superego that deals with morality, right and wrong. The ego's job is simply to fulfill the needs of the id, but to do it within the constraints of reality. It does it in a realistic, rational, logical way. And that's what the reality principle is. It's rationality and logic. Okay. So we have to interact in the real world, the external, objective world. And we need to get our needs satisfied, you know. If we don't get our needs satisfied, you know, we're all going to die anyway. So we need to get our needs satisfied. But we have to do it in the context of the real world. Dinner's ready. If the need-fulfilling behavior is too risky, it directs our behavior to another way to meet the need. Sometimes it would involve delaying our gratification, and I'll show you a little video of that in a moment. The mechanism for matching the attention-producing need to a real object or activity would be called the secondary process. So in other words, you want to have this, you have this need and you have to now attach it to something real in the real world to get it satisfied. That's what you need to do. But let's talk about delaying gratification for a moment. Realize that you need to be able to satisfy the needs of the id. But hey, the id can't get what it wants, whenever it wants, right away. You have to deal with the real world. You can't always get your needs satisfied. Okay? And this brings up the importance of delaying gratification. You need to be able to get your needs satisfied, but be able to delay it at times. I'm going to show you a little video, a little classic video that, or rather an illustration of a lot of studies that they do in delaying gratification with children. So let me show you that video, and I'll then turn off the oven.
Tests their impulse control. Since more self-control means more empathy, more consideration of others.
I am going to take 4 M&Ms.
He uses a familiar psychological exercise,
I'm going to put them on this plate.
tempting them with candy. Keep in mind, 1/3 of all the children taking the test you're about to see cannot control their impulses and eat the treat. As we watch through a two-way mirror, the doctor tells each dilly that if he can wait to eat the M&Ms, he'll be rewarded with 4 more later. Then the doctor leaves the room.
This is a test of a child's ability to delay gratification, to get something more if they can wait.
The exercise lasts 12 torturous minutes, a lifetime to a preschooler. 6 little mouths watering at the prospect of candy, and devising 60 different strategies for resisting temptation. They'll try anything, hiding, or clapping, or counting. And when it's over, amazingly, every single dilly kept control.
More, you get 8. Good job. Okay.
Doctors told us they were surprised that in this case, being a multiple may have given them an emotional head start on a lifetime of friendship and satisfaction.
8 M&Ms, lunch, grab your 8 M&Ms. It's clearly not an easy task for them, but they've developed skills to do so, and I wouldn't be surprised if they developed that in their day-to-day life. You know, what you get taught by your parents and what you get taught in your family is very often what you use in your day-to-day life.
Okay. So keep in mind, the kids in that video were kids who were they were multiples. So in other words, there was like I guess 6 or 7 of them or whatever. But reason when you can think about it, but they were able to delay gratification. It makes a lot of sense, because if you have a lot of brothers and sisters, you've got no choice but to have to delay gratification. You're not always going to be first and get whatever you want, because you have to wait for your brothers and sisters as well. So that's an effective way to learn. But there's a whole body of research on delaying gratification, and there seems to be some research suggesting that the children who are able to delay gratification, when they become adults, they become more successful. They do better in school. The argument is that maybe that ability to hold off and wait for the immediate reward, maybe wait for a bigger reward later on, is something that can help us be successful. And I tend to believe that is the case, at least to some degree. Okay, so in this secondary process, let's talk a little bit more about that. You want to find a match between the image coming from your id, the image of what your id wants rather, and an actual object or an activity that can actually get that need satisfied directly. And again, this has to do with, you think about higher order thought. There's your problem solving, your planning. Okay, so for example, let's say you're sitting in a psychology class. Let's say it's a lecture, not like an online thing. You're in a lecture, right? And you got 45 minutes left to go in the lecture, but you're pretty hungry. You want to go get something to eat. Well, your id is going to say, I want to eat, I want food, gimme. You can't really do that in the middle of a psychology lecture. So what you might do is, kind of, from Freud's perspective, like project an image of eating, of food to your id to at least temporarily satisfy it. But what you have to do as an ego, what your ego has to do is you need to get those needs satisfied. So you have to wait until class is over and then walk over to McDonald's and get yourself something to eat. So that's something you can definitely do. But again, that's your ego's job, is to plan all this activity and actually get the job done. So then, therefore, what is the inherent conflict between the id and the ego? Remember we said that the concept of psychodynamic perspective, the psychodynamic aspect of this, that personality is dynamic, that there's interaction and there's conflict between the various components of our personality. So there's definitely going to be a conflict between the id and the ego. The conflict, of course, is that the id wants it right away, but the ego has to deal with reality and has to get the needs satisfied, the id satisfied, but has to do it in a practical way. And ego will sometimes have to, out of necessity, delay gratification. The id doesn't like that. So this is where there is an inherent conflict between the id and the ego. The ego just cannot always, every single time, instantly get the id what it wants. And then, of course, there is the superego. This is, what our parents teach us, what society teaches us as far as right from wrong. It comes from our loving relationships with our parents. We do what our parents think is right and makes us feel good. We avoid what our parents don't like, so we avoid punishment. And again, so in other words, we're learning to satisfy what our parents expect, and to essentially avoid doing what disappoints them. And again, that's part of how we develop our sense of morality. So we incorporate those values. Introjection is where we incorporate them, and they become part of who we are. Okay? So this is where the superego is developing. So it makes sense, for example, the newborn baby would not yet have a superego because the newborn baby has not yet learned from mom and dad what is right, what is wrong, what pleases them, what doesn't, and so on. And this again operates like the ego at all levels of consciousness. Consciously we know the rules of what is right and wrong, so that's where it clearly fits in our conscious mind. In our preconscious, we can certainly have memories of the various rules of right and wrong from our religion, from society, whatnot, and we can bring them to memory, no problem. But we also have it in our unconscious, maybe, where we don't understand why we're feeling guilty. We don't understand why we feel maybe a sense of shame. And maybe it's coming from some guilty feeling that we get from something in our unconscious. And so that's an interesting conception of what the superego here. Two components of the superego, which kind of tells us where that's coming from: the ego ideal and the conscience. So on the ego ideal is our definition of what is good, what is mean to be a good person. So the ego ideal is what we strive for, what we want to become. Okay, it is, and we feel pride when we can achieve it. So the ego ideal is what we are aspiring to, based on what we know is what is good and perfect. The conscience tells us what is bad, what is prohibited, what is wrong. And if we don't conform, we are going to be feeling shame and guilt if we do something bad. So the goals of the superego are to inhibit those id impulses, because sometimes those impulses coming from the id are not exactly nice. They may be immoral. And as a result, the goal of superego is to inhibit that, to keep that down in our unconscious and push it away, push it away, push it away. We don't want to have to even think that. We don't even want to, certainly we don't want to act on it. The ego has a conflict with the superego because the ego's job is to get the id's needs satisfied. But the superego says, it is immoral to do that. Maybe they say maybe it's immoral to eat at McDonald's. Maybe it's more ethical to eat vegetables or something like that. Who knows? What does our superego know anyway? But that may be what it would want the ego to do instead of doing just what the id wants. Again, it guides us towards perfection. But of course, perfection is not realistic, and that's a problem. And so if somebody can get overemphasis on the superego, they may be overly moralistic, kind of like the opposite of being impulsive. They're actually overly hesitant to act on his or her needs. So we clearly are not, we don't want the superego to have too much power. And that's why we need to be able to balance these competing forces. You have the id, the ego, and the superego, and of course the external environment. All of these forces are dynamic, they're interacting with each other, and there are inherent opportunities for conflict between them. We already talked about the id-ego conflict and the superego-ego conflict. Of course, the superego and the id, all of them have conflict with each other. So we need to be able to release the tension issues coming from the id, and to do it as quickly as possible in a way that is socially acceptable, that's from the superego's point of view, and also realistic, consistent with the external environment. If you can do all of that, if you can balance all these conflicting forces, Freud called it ego strength. So ego strength, if you have very little ego strength, then you're going to be torn among the conflicting pressures. You might be more attached to one aspect of your personality than another. So you might be dominated more by your id or dominated more by your superego. That would indicate you have a problem with ego strength. Your ego has to balance all of this. You need to manage all these pressures. You need to be able to balance off morality and your needs that you need to get taken care of. Do all of that together, in a balanced way. But you also don't necessarily want to have too much ego strength. If your ego is in complete control, gets its needs satisfied no matter what, and will do it in a kind of a cold and logical way, but maybe not too much about morality, and maybe not too much about more or less, kind of just maybe boring. So the idea is to balance it. You don't want to have too much of any one of these aspects of your personality. You need to be able to have a nice balance. Now,